Thank you all so much for being here today. We hope you had the opportunity to go and look at both exhibitions. The Southwest Black Arts Collective has an exhibition that's up until 4 p.m. today at Fechin House at Taos Art Museum, and TAAC has an exhibition right over there that's up for the week at Stables Gallery, and I think some of you are actually in it. So, if you are, thank you for being in it, and if you're not, go and support the arts. We have some really amazing artists. We have some scholarships that we gave out to some high school students from Santa Fe, and another really wonderful adult scholar, Roxanne Marquez. I think is she from Albuquerque? Yeah. So today's panel discussion is moderated by Bradley Petty over here, and the two artists and multifaceted human beings, Elizabeth Burden and Lauren Dana Smith, will be talking. And we'll be discussing kinship and art making. And so I'll do a brief intro on the panelists and the host, and at the end we'll have a little bit of time for questions. So if you want to take notes, please do, and save your questions till the end. We love questions, so please have some. So Bradley Petty is a post-war and contemporary art historian whose research examines how Black artists across the diaspora engage the intersection of geography and identity. He serves as the 2025 curatorial intern in post-war and contemporary art at the Dallas Museum of Art and is a McGuire Public Service Fellow. At the DMA, he has given public talks on Wu Sang's Girl Talk and on the museum's post-war and contemporary minimalism gallery. His MA thesis focuses on Black art and community in the desert Southwest, showing how artists transform arid environments into spaces of memory, spirituality, and kinship. More broadly, his work highlights how African diasporic artists generate new art histories by imagining geographies of belonging, creativity, and relation across the globe. So thank you so much for being here. Bradley flew in from Dallas, so we're so grateful for him to come all the way up here. Elizabeth Burden, who is also in, I'm also in both collectives. So Elizabeth Burden is one of the founding members. She is a visual artist, gallerist, and scholar from Tucson, Arizona. She has exhibited works in galleries and institutions across the US and in Australia, including Tucson Museum of Art, Dunbar Cultural Center, and Capitol Art Museum in Arizona, Partridge Arts Division Gallery in Victoria, Australia, SIAC Galleries in Chicago, Bohem Gallery in San Marcos, California, and Harwood Art Center, SFAI, and Taos Art Museum in New Mexico, just to name a few. She is currently a board member of SFAI. She has worked in prestigious residencies like the studios at MASMOCA, SFAI, Banff Center for the Arts and Creativity, and has been a fellow in Arizona State University's Mellon Projecting All Voices Fellowship. She has a BFA in Studio Art and an MS in Geographic Information Science from the University of Arizona, and an MFA in Studio Art from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And that's actually where I met Liz. We were in an MFA program together. And I think most of you probably know Lauren Dana Smith. Lauren is a multidisciplinary research-based artist, curator, arts organizer, educator, and a practicing art therapist. She has taught at NYU, Southwestern College, ICANN, School of Medicine, the New School, and is currently a professor in the Arts Therapy Department at Pratt Institute in New York. She has exhibited work across the US, South Korea, India, and London. She is the founder and board chair of TAAC and the founder of the House of Archetype. I'm not sure if any of you were at her Halloween party the other night, but it was pretty amazing. And thank you if you were, because she raised quite a bit of money for the CAV. She has a BA in English Lit from Skidmore College, an MPS in Creative Arts Therapy and Creativity Development from Pratt Institute, and she has also co-authored 4 chapters in clinical texts and multiple other publications. So I'm just gonna hand it over to you.
It's back on. So I usually, if I'm moderating a panel, I do like to start. A lot of people ask, how's everyone doing? And I'm obviously not gonna be able to take the time to get that answer directly from you. So what I do like to say is I like to wish everyone well, because we're all dealing with something. And thank you all for being here. I'll thank the panelists as well. And I think it's really important that we kind of set the stage that way, because I do want the conversation to be fruitful, that everybody, including myself, learn something. Part of the reason that I got invited to moderate this panel is because I am writing my master's thesis on SBAC. And so I had the opportunity this summer to spend some time with Liz in her studio and at the project space in Tucson, and see some of the work that they've done together, kind of how they utilize the space. And I got to meet Lauren today. It was really nice to meet you. But we'll start kind of with the theme of the panel. And my first question, at least to start us off, is how do you see your relationship to each other in each collective that you're a part of? And how does that inform your artistic practice? And I'm gonna turn this mic on and off because it moves a lot, so.
Beauty before age.
Please. Thanks, Bradley, and thanks everybody for being here, and thanks, Liz. You know, I had the absolute pleasure of encountering SBAC last year, where sort of, I don't know, accidentally, maybe, but I don't know if that's a thing. I think accidentally on purpose, right? Our paths crossed because I had an exhibition at the Harwood Art Center in Albuquerque alongside SBAC's exhibition of Beloved, which is, of course, here at the Fechin House, or that iteration of that exhibition. And so had the opportunity to meet SBAC artists and get to know each other and start to, I think, pick up on some threads of relatedness between our respective practices. And Bianca, who you just heard from, was in that as well, obviously. And so that, I think, just sort of for all of us was a little bit of a moment of percolation, just hey, you know, we're seeing some things here that maybe some through lines. I certainly, in my own work, I felt like there were some through lines of exploration around narrative and around disrupting dominant discourse. And that's something that in my art practice, personally, and then in my community-based art practice, I think about a lot, and in my practice as an art therapist. And so I think that is the sort of the origin. And then from there, we just, you know, I think we just started to really like each other and like started to think about, you know, what each group, what we were working on respectively, and felt like, is there an invitation here? Is there an opportunity for cross-pollination? And that's a lot of the way that our organization, TAAC, likes to operate. You know, one thread informs the next, and so on.
Yeah, I tend to believe that meeting was synchronicity, not accident, in a lot of ways, and that the universe brings us. I'm not a woo-woo person really in that way a lot, but I do believe that the universe brings us certain things, including, you know, been doing my art practice for a long time, but the universe moved me along to being a full-time artist in May when I was laid off from my sustainability fund job. So I do believe there are synchronicity things that are going on, which allows me to do different things and explore. I mean, Bradley, I think your question and your provocation for me has a couple of different things. One is, I think, broadly collectives. And one of the reasons we founded SBAC, and I have a sense one of the reasons that TAAC was founded as well, was to hold space for artists in the Southwest. And this notion of holding space, I think, for ourselves and for our communities is something that has always been important, but is becoming even more deeply important in these times, in these moments that we're living in. I think that practice of holding space in and of itself does some of the things that Lauren was already talking about. It disrupts things in a way that other practices might not. We could not, I think for SBAC, we could not make any other work or have any other shows after the ones we have. It's not going to happen that way, but we could not. And we still would have accomplished a lot by having held the space for the work over the last couple of years. And so it is both the relationality, I think, of the individuals and the collective that then leads to doing something that then leads to something else in the community that I think has been important. And then when you grow that by connecting to another collective, right? Now you've got a collective with a collective that's a bigger collective that has different energy. I mean, it grows, I think, in ways that are synchronous in some ways, that are organic in some ways, that then lead to some intentionalities in other ways, that allows both individual and collective practice to thrive, and sets the stage for showing, demonstrating, embodying different ways of being in the world that we're in. And so that's why, to me, doing the hard work, and sometimes it's very hard work of being a collective, is necessary.
And that's a really good segue. Kind of what I was thinking about is there, in the scholarship, there seems to be a delineation between kinship and collective. And so usually it's anthropologists that are debating whether or not the two are conflated or not. And so as an art historian, we tend to engage when we encounter artist collectives. So how do you see the members, each of you, a part of your collective as kin or not? Or is collective more of an apt description of what you see yourself as? That's a loaded question.
The answer is yes.
I think, kinship, when you parse it out anthropologically, right, this idea of it being biologically driven or sort of state driven, right? I love an expansion of that definition, personally. I love the idea that there's the potential for interrelatedness outside of biology. I think that exists socioculturally in a lot of different settings, right? If we think about chosen family as a prime example, right, which has served important purposes not only for individuals but for social movements. I think that when we can get outside of this idea, which is very linear, it's very binary, right, of you can only be related to a person because of a blood lineage, that's a narrow interpretation from my perspective. And then if we're going to be, defining ourselves through the state, well, that's probably several other panel discussions we could have. But I would say it's much more optimistic, and I feel related. I'll say related a lot as a therapist. But there's a lot of opportunity for us, just as people, to think about other ways that we can connect, and whether that's through creativity, which I think is absolutely a form of knowing, of intelligence, of shared experience. It could be also through service, perhaps, and then that word of, so in my mind, I guess collective and kinship have an intersection. A collective, for me, an art collective always has the potential. It doesn't always work this way. It is hard. I agree with Liz. It can be really hard when especially if you have so many folks. I think we have something like 500 plus artists in TAAC at this point. So it's a lot of making sure that we are holding that space responsibly and ethically, and also expansively. So there's opportunity for everybody to share, bring their own lived experiences into the picture. But I think of it as a platform. I think of it as a shared container that has a lot to offer. And I bristle myself in my own art making and then in community arts organizing at this idea that we have to define ourselves ever so narrowly. And that's a big part of our TAAC mission, is that we get this question a lot. I fielded this question 2 days ago, this artwork isn't abstract enough, right? Or some other parameter that's sort of, we get from the outside that's not from us individually. So I think that there just needs to be a little bit of a loosening on those kinds of definitions. Personally, it creates more generosity and more opportunity for kinship and the collective.
Do you have something else, Liz?
It's interesting because I didn't realize TAAC was that large. So SBAC is the opposite of that. We started as SBAN, the Southwest Black Arts Network, and very early in our development decided to change it to collective and by design make it smaller. And so I think part of that, was because we were thinking of, and at the time it was also only female identified or non-binary folks. And so we were thinking sisterhood, I think, to a certain extent. And I think that has both value and possibilities and potentialities, and it also can carry some baggage with it. Personally, I can only speak for me. There are other members in the room that I maybe call up and have them take the mic, because they may think differently. But for me, sisterhood is a powerful thing, and it can also be a difficult thing. Again, we have fraught relationships with our mothers, our sisters, our daughters, our granddaughters. Because of that, the blood kind of thing, and that's when, in queer communities and other communities, we go to chosen family, right? In the African American community, we have the tradition of, that nuclear family has been a model that's been imposed and never really been the model anyway, that you have aunties and uncles and all of that are not blood at all, but they're still family. And so I think all of that's in there in terms of thinking about the relationality of what a collective does. However, I also think a collective is a family is a kind of collective, but there are many kinds of collectives that are not families. And so I think collective also, to me, connotes a different level of attentionality again. I think of power and empowerment, of creating power, of wielding power, and I choose that phrase consciously, of collective work and responsibility that sometimes is implied by family, but not always. I think it brings with it a whole host of other things that sometimes families do and sometimes families don't. Yeah, and so I think for SBAC, we're family plus. I think that's where we are.
And at least that's the way. At
I'm
least I'm
checking in with the
approaching it.
collective members that are here. Like,
They're nodding. They're nodding. At least that's the way I approach it.
Yeah.
And the way I've at least started to synthesize the information that I'm getting both from you guys and from kind of the scholarship is that to Lauren's point, scholars aren't as strict about kinship being blood related, but there is a shared either practice, a shared tradition, or of some sort, and it's not always state power. So Michael Salas talks about the indigenous communities of Alaska and British Columbia, and they even believe that the sweat of an individual that pours into the soil and then that soil then produces food, that's how you become kin. So there's all sorts of different ways in which people associate or disassociate with each other and become kin. And I have kind of settled, and this is what I hope you guys could help me parse out, I've kind of settled on the idea that at least with SBAC, and you can tell me for TAAC with 500 members how that relates, but that they're neither. And for me, there seems to be a bridge between being, this kind of definitive collective, definitive kinship group. And to me, that bridge is what's called the repertoire, where individuals gather together and trade information in ways that isn't archival. Body gestures, song, oral traditions that then transfer information to each other, but they do that within kinship bonds, but also within collectives. Does that fit what you do in TAAC and SBAC as far as your artistic practices? Are you trading that information with each other in those collectives, in your individual, or not individual, but respective collectives? And I could make that more concise, but.
I would say with SBAC not as directly as I would like, and I'll just say that. But we're also young. We're toddlers as a collective. We've been in existence 2 years, going on 3 years now. And because of wanting the collectivity to emerge organically, I think that's a direction I think we might go in terms of sharing. Why I say organically is, if Liz were in charge, and she's not, we'd be doing things differently, but I'm not. It's a collective, and so, Phoenix is one of the members, she's saying for sure. And this does have me think back to family, because in some ways, it's a knowing, it's an understanding of certain times people step forward and take leadership and step back. And so I think the way that we have shared, like there have been 3 different iterations of Beloved. 3 different people have led those iterations of different iterations. Phoenix, who's in the back as a member, did the first iteration in Albuquerque. She took the lead on that, did the proposal, pulled things together, worked with the Harwood to have that happen. The one that was in Tucson, I guess I kind of took the lead on that one. And it changed in form and substance, even though the theme of it was the same. I'm going someplace with this, everybody. This third one then that's here, Bianca took the lead on. And so I think while we may not be sharing it yet around our specific artistic practices in that way, I think there's some conversations, even as small as we have on duos or triads, that are happening, but not as a collective as a whole. I do think in terms of presenting, that is the way we're thinking, that we came up with this theme of Beloved. It is expansive enough that someone can take it and run with it and do a different configuration of different works of folks in the collective. And for the last 2, we have expanded it. Granville, who is not female identified and not non-binary, I don't think. He, they, was added to, if you will, our collective as a part of the show. So the last 2 shows.
And just for clarification, this particular iteration.
So he's, and then in Tucson, he had some pieces in Tucson as well. Different pieces. All of us had different pieces in each of the shows, I think. But in that way, I think in the selection of what was shown, as I've looked at each show, We haven't had these conversations, but I've learned something from the other collective members and the folks who curated those parts of the shows about how those things were put together and where they were hung. And so, have we had like formal crits or the? No, but I think the way that those three shows have come together have provided opportunities for each of us to learn about different people's practices in different ways. The way Phoenix uses space, the way the textiles have informed the space and held space in the two galleries. The process that Bianca uses in laser cutting the work, how Liz Deneau, who's another member, does installation in each of her installations, even though the materials have been the same, the installations have been very different in each site. And here, she's got two 2D pieces rather than an installation, but that are very much the same. You know, so I've learned a lot watching them. And I'm probably the youngest. I'm not quite the oldest person. Phoenix and I were inside. I'm the next oldest person in the collective, but I'm the youngest artist. As in, my practice is the shortest, I think, of everyone else that's in the group. And so, I don't know if that answered your question.
No, that did.
Yeah.
Lauren, I'll let you answer. But.
Well, Bradley, something that I'm thinking about as I'm listening to, as I listen to your question and listening to Liz, is a word that just keeps popping into my head, so I'll say it out loud, and it's empathy. Because I think that, you know, well, obviously with that many folks in our collective, we're not in proximity close, where it's all of, you know, it's open to all of northern New Mexico, and so we don't always see each other on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis, and we come together during our community exhibitions, and then we have a lot of other programming with other institutions. However, I think that there's something that we do learn from each other when we think about empathy, and there's an empathy that's inherent in creating artwork and sharing it with others and receiving people's impressions of your work. And I think that relates to some of the anthropological terminology, right, around mutuality, right? So we have this mutuality, the sense of belonging to a group. I think it's important also that I share with everybody that TAAC is sort of unique in some ways in terms of being a collective. We have members, and we use the word members kind of broadly. We don't, anyone can be a member. Someone can decide to participate in TAAC, and poof, they're a member. And people can self-determine that their work is abstract, and we believe them. And that's really important. And we don't have membership dues, and a lot of people ask, and some people want to pay us, and we say no. And we also, for our community exhibitions, don't take any portion of proceeds for the artwork that's sold. So we don't operate, again, from that idea of kinship being dictated by sort of the state. Like we're capitalism, sort of adjacent to the state, or is the state, or wherever we are at this stage of capitalism at this point in time. Late, very, very late. But I would say that because of those features of our group, I would argue that that creates maybe more of a sense of that mutuality or belonging. We want everybody to have an opportunity to participate, and that could look like showing work in an exhibition. That's great. It could also look like interacting through social media, or attending a panel, or being part of a publication, or being part of a discussion, or volunteering at any of our programs. And that is the thing that I think is the binding piece, and I think that has everything to do with empathy. And that's what I think part of why groups like SBAC and TAAC and other collectives that are out there are so vital right now, because there's an absolute erosion of empathy, broadly speaking, I think. And that we have to hold on to these moments that we have where we can, feel contained, safely contained as a group, or have an alliance. And that's flexible, right? That container is flexible. It's not dictated by money or, the prestige of however long someone's been making artwork. Anybody is welcome, so.
And I think that that's an interesting, your comment makes me think of, there's a framework, and I'm not going to be able to recall who the scholar is, that comes out of Indian country that talks about belonging, mastery, interdependence, and generosity. Mm-hmm. And those 4 things being very important across our lives. And so I think, regardless of size, that's what a collective does that may be slightly different than a repertoire. I hear the generosity piece, that everybody brings something to the collective. Each of the ways of knowing, being, doing, and skill sets are different, but combined, that makes something stronger because we're creating a sense of belonging, right? Because we're sharing skills with one another in different ways, because we see the work that we're doing as being interdependent and holding that space. All of those things, I think, are central to what a collective does. And so it looks different in a collective of 7 than it does in a collective of 500. But those processes that are in play, I think, are the same.
Mm-hmm. I'd agree.
And so how do you see and I'm going to invoke Bianca here, but because she's a shared member of both groups, but how do you see the 2 collectives interacting outside of just this exhibition that's up now, but more broadly across?
We're plotting.
Plotting. I like that.
No, we really are.
Legitimately plotting.
I love it.
Hoping to have the collective in Tucson to do a show May, June, July, late spring, summer in the space that we have there now. Mm-hmm. That we may be getting a slightly bigger space, but I'm talking about later. So yeah, we're plotting to create or to deepen almost desire lines that run between Tucson, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, Taos. That's a long trod path, long before us and long after us. So what are the things that we can do that contribute to that history in a way that runs down 10, 25, 40, whatever.
Yeah. Well, I think that also speaks to this idea that disrupts this idea of hierarchy that can be frequently as part of membership-based groups or collectives in general, and that hierarchy is determined by people, right? But then if we are thinking about really deconstructing, and we're thinking about geography, we're thinking about land, and we're maybe, thinking about the fact that there are, borrowing from lots of different cultures, but the idea that it's not only people that are making the rules here, it's not only people with relationships, it's not only people that we have empathy for and relationship with, it's the land, it's the place, it's, it's getting from one place to another, it's what, to your point about, the sweat going into the soil that helps nourish the people that are taking part of, in agriculture in those places. I think that when we start to ourselves get outside of, state lines, get outside of these precious ideas or containers that we have and think, well, it's very much, I think, driven by curiosity. I'm not sure what our exhibition will look like, but I do know that I feel very invested and engaged in exploring the current conversation and the dialogue, and very invested in seeing the iterations of the beloved exhibition and wondering, how can TAAC participate or offer resources or offer ideas or intermingle ideas? How can we intersect in a way that's sustainable and meaningful and, very respectful of each other's, I think, origins, and, also, again, just coming at it with a spirit of creativity and curiosity, which I think, honestly, I say this to my students all the time who are nervous about being therapists for the first time. Very nervous. And they should be, because it's a big deal. But, if you show up with curiosity and you're present, then that's okay. I think that's enough. You don't need to know everything. And hey, you've never done this before, so you don't have to be the expert at it, right? And so I think for us as collectives, we haven't partnered in this way before, but we're present and we're curious, and I think that's a very good beginning.
I also think you noted Bianca's role as kind of as a bridge.
Yes.
And so I also think the embodiment of different ways of being where, you've got this collective, this cell of people here, and the cell of people here, and the cell of people here, and the importance of those boundary spanners, those bridge people who make connections in different ways. We're talking about this as an art collective and art practices and the like, but I think, again, in these times, those rebuilding our capacities to do those kinds of bridge and boundary spanning things is essential in art, in life, in lots of different ways, if we really want to move forward in a intentional, progressive way.
Well, what it brings to mind, at least for me, is I think, Lauren, you mentioned something about the container. And if Bianca then is a bridge between one group and another, if she is, then how does the geographic container, the Southwest or Taos itself, then reflect back this idea of kinship? So now this is circular intentionally. So I like I said, I don't believe it's either or either. But how does you have an emissary that goes from one collective to the other, translating what one group is kind of pollinator even, and then bringing it back to another group. But then there's this geographic container that, because you're teaching at Pratt, I know Bianca's in school in New York, so this is not the New York Black Artist Collective, right? This is the Southwest Black Artist Collective. So does the container matter or does it not? Is it tied to the geography in any way? For either of you?
Well, for TAAC, I think it's an inspiration point, and this is something that we talked about a lot when we started. This idea of how specific do we have to be? Are we going to be the arbiters of, who identifies as having a connection to Taos, New Mexico? And that's a very colonial construct to think that we have some sort of any kind of claim on place. I think that would be wrong. But there is a very long legacy of art communities here in Taos, very different kinds of art communities, and of course, the home of the Taos Pueblo, thousands of years of creative and artistic resourcing and legacy. So we landed on, at the very beginning, we wanted to use Taos as a point of inspiration because there's something, a lot of us feel this way, that there's something that this place, the community has to offer, its vibrancy, its potential, it's sort of an indescribable thing. And we don't want to determine if somebody can attach to that or not, right? And so we have expanded, and we have, expanded to northern New Mexico, all of New Mexico, regionally now. We were in LA this summer. And so in some ways it's an ethos, I think. I really loved your language, Liz, about the idea of pollinator, and very, grateful to Bianca for helping to, be a catalyst of pollination here. And I think that's a start. It's a starting point, right? It's a origin point, and every story needs one. And then from there, who knows what's possible? Then other relationships start to form. That's what's happened within TAAC. Broadly speaking, we've had artists who've moved closer to Taos or Santa Fe to be part of our group. We've had other artists form sort of smaller groups and other shows. And I think that's beautiful, and I welcome all of it, and I hope there's more of it, because that goes back to that idea of the container being safe but flexible.
Yeah, so geography. For SBAC, I think it's not as complex, but maybe complicated. It's Southwest because this is where we be. And we felt the need, this is where we are, not a whole lot of black folks in certain parts of the Southwest, and that we needed to come together and create a network. And I think, again, the network initially, the idea was like cells, right? Yeah. It could be small, little, each doing their own thing, but connected in some way regionally. Having said that, I think all of us make art in the Southwest, but not necessarily of the Southwest. And so that's been, I think, an interesting conversation, less within the collective, but more externally, to talk about what does it mean to live here, Tucson, Santa Fe, Angel Fire, Albuquerque. But our work is about being in the Southwest, perhaps, but not of the Southwest, right? You're not going to look at any of the pieces that are in the Beloved show here and think that's Southwest art. I don't think. Maybe. I don't think so. So the geography as a container
And maybe not.
Well, it's an interesting question, and why I pause that is because we're coming up against now some of the other questions. So yeah, Bianca's spending part of her time here, other places. I'm going to be splitting my time pretty soon between Tucson and Lincoln, Nebraska, because I have a show there. That's where I'm from. That's a lot of my work is about that. Those images that are in the show, the Fechin House. Are historic images from the turn of the 20th century in Nebraska, because that's where I was born and raised, and I still have a connection to that geography in a different way. The show that's going to be in Nebraska is called Elsewhere, the Prairie Was Ours. None of the artists that are in this show live there anymore. There are going to be 3 of us, but we all still have a connection to that place. Make work in a way that channels that place, but is not Nebraska art, if that makes sense. And I think that's true of the members of SBAC, that we channel the Southwest and we're in the Southwest, but it's not of the Southwest or Southwestern art, if that makes sense.
No, it definitely makes sense. And I'm so glad Lauren invoked the Taos Society of Artists because that was exactly what I was thinking about. You get a group of, frankly, migrants who came to Santa Fe and Taos, at the very beginning of the 20th century, and some of them at the end of the 19th, they show up and they do engage with the geography in a way that is deliberate. If you're not from the area and you drive into town, if you've seen any of O'Keeffe's work, you immediately see that church and he's like, how many times has she painted that thing? And it's because she was so enthralled with the location and with its architecture and with its geography in a lot of ways, that they decided to make, and at least this is my semi-professional opinion, what came to be defined as what Southwest art looks like. That group in particular got to define a lot of what the art represents more broadly. To Liz's point then, that aesthetic excludes African-American voices in a lot of ways. So now we're,
a lot of other voices.
Yeah, and a lot of other voices, indigenous voices. Even though indigenous voices have definitely been able to stake out their own claim on their own indigeneity and their own connection to the geography. And someone who studies post-war and contemporary art, I'm looking at, El Paso, Las Vegas, most of the Mojave, obviously Tucson and Albuquerque and Santa Fe. The populations after the second Great Migration of those places increased. So North Las Vegas is predominantly black. So is Northeast El Paso. El Paso has a black mayor today. And so what are we saying when the art doesn't necessarily reflect, and back to your point about empathy, how are these collectives then reinforcing that idea or expanding that idea? What does that mean then for individuals, collectives to be just a collective or a kinship group that then reinforces each other's space and place in the geography? That ringing a bell for anybody?
Well, it's interesting you said that because so the biennial, if the site biennial that's going on right now. So the one black person who's ever existed in the Southwest is Esteban, right? Estevanico. And he's in a mural, a vinyl mural. He's represented in a vinyl mural that's at Santa Fe. Now, there are African-American artists that are part of SITE, so I can't say that, but none of them are Southwest that I know of. None of them reside in the Southwest, I don't think. You know, so it's an interesting thought or provocation that you're saying, Bradley. I'm not sure I have a response to it, however, though. I mean, it makes me think.
Well, I think that that's part of the origin story of TAAC in some ways, too, where if people think about Southwestern art, and it's perhaps, you know, I'm going to think about like the content of the art. It's a lot of representational work. It's a lot of landscape. It's a lot of, you know, thinking about the Taos Society of Artists, thinking about, you know, some of the groups that have existed that reinforced that narrative, right? And so then that narrative gets distributed throughout the rest of, you know, art-consuming culture. And then suddenly there's this idea that's, you know, constellated that this is what Southwestern art is, right? It excludes, you know, so many folks, BIPOC folks, queer community, indigenous communities, women. We wanted to, again, create a bit more of a platform for anybody that wants to participate, and in so doing, our hope, you know, sort of a secondary outcome of that, potentially, and it's in development, we're also really new, right? We're really new. We'll be 5 years in 2027. So this was started as a little idea in 2020 because we couldn't actually visit each other in our studios because of the pandemic. And we thought, well, who are the abstract artists out working here, you know? And then we just started, we started to connect that way. But I think in creating a very broad platform and that flexible container, we are then able to shift a narrative and retell a different story, and that's something that we talk about a lot. That's something that Bianca and I talk about a lot, is this idea of retelling the story of abstract art in northern New Mexico.
Just making sure we're good on time.
And what you just said has me thinking that I need to rethink my conception of Southwest art. So I take back everything I said about every piece that's in the Fechin, that's a part of the Beloved show, is Southwestern art.
Yeah.
You know, well, no, really, I think that rethinking it and reclaiming it, because it was made in the Southwest. We're Southwestern artists. If that doesn't make it Southwestern art, I don't know what does then.
Right, and think about that idea of that mutuality and empathy. That's what I think about, right? We're all making art. We're here, we're sharing our practices. Whether you make one piece of art a year or whether you have a prolific practice, you know, you're informed by your community, by place, by folks that came before you, et cetera.
By memory. To your point about
Yeah.
the Lincoln, Nebraska piece.
Right, and I mean, the trope is about like the light in the Southwest, but it is true. The light here is different, right? When it turns in the fall, that golden light you will not see anyplace else.
Doesn't exist in New York City.
Right, and so it does do things to the art. Even if I'm making something about Nebraska, right? The pull to me to do something that has like gold leaf comes from that golden life. It doesn't come from someplace else. And so, I mean, it is, I think, informed by it. So, yeah.
And I could never have made the work I was making, that I am making now, when I lived in New York. I can't exactly explain it, but my total sort of schema has shifted. And the work that I make now doesn't explicitly reference the Southwest. There are elements of the Southwest visually in the work, but it's much more of a, you know, explorations about internal, you know, processes and consciousness and things like that. But all of that is only what it is because I'm participating here.
Right, and if I'm being honest, you know, I have a connection to Nebraska. I consider myself Nebraskan, but I've actually lived in Tucson longer than I've lived anywhere else. I've been in Tucson 30 years. if that doesn't make me Tucson-ense, I don't know what does, right? And so in that respect, you know, I'm a southwestern, you know, Nebraskan artist. I don't know, but so it's Southwest art.
I mean, yeah, not unlike what the members of the Taos Society artists did. They moved, they made a home for themselves here in New Mexico and Arizona and elsewhere. And the person that keeps coming to mind for me, at least, and we'll get back to kinship, I promise. But the person that comes up to me is Donald Judd. When he showed up in Marfa, he made that place his own, literally, with the architecture. He took it and recreated most of the buildings and then used the old barracks to create most of what he did. And now, you know, there's obviously the Judd Foundation that operates both out of Marfa and New York, but when you think about minimalism in context to the actual geography and the way it looks there, that's the searing image, that's the predominant image that's out there about Judd's work, unless you're like a scholar of Judd specifically. So I think in a lot of ways that geography then becomes a form or a bond for kinship. That even though you may not necessarily be making work that is specific to the geography or the place, because you live here and because you are in association and in conversation with the members of each of your collectives, the bonding element then becomes the geography as well, even though it might not reference it specifically. Anybody have any thoughts on whether or not that applies?
My mind is going off in a totally different artistic direction, so
please let it do.
Come back to that because abstraction. Lauren's comments about abstraction and what is abstract, and you know, you started the previous question about blacks in the Southwest, and blackness is an abstraction, right? Oh. Sorry, I'm not using the mic, but I probably don't really need a mic. You know, and so what does it mean to step into thinking about blackness as an abstraction within the geography and, you know, the forms, the deconstructed forms, the non-objects that some of us in the collective are making as abstract forms, and working with TAAC and, you know, pushing that notion of abstraction of a variety of things, not just the aesthetic, or applying that aesthetic of abstraction to the ways that we think about operating as collectives, as operating in the. So that's where my mind started going. Sorry, that's the.
No, it's good. I mean, we talk about that.
That's the essay in me. That's my mother.
We talk about, you know, back to that idea of really, really trying hard not to have a definition of what abstract art is. It's like, who wants that job? Like, I don't want that job. But maybe you want that job. And a lot of people try to tell us. But I will say, you know, we embrace abstract concepts, collaborations. It doesn't mean that the work needs to be, you know, identifiable as an abstract or abstraction. You know, the idea of collaborating with SBAC could be an abstraction. The idea of, you know, last year we collaborated with, we had an exhibition at the Millicent Rogers Museum that was in response to an exhibition at the Harwood Museum, and that kind of encouraged or invited a dialogue between three institutions that wouldn't have necessarily happened otherwise. That is an abstract community concept. We get very siloed in our institutional lives, and there are so many ways, again, thinking about that flexibility, and there's so many ways that we can engage. And so I think about, you know, the Taos Abstract Artist Collective is a platform. It's not only an exhibition. Frequently people associate us with exhibitions because when we do have an exhibition, as we do right now, we have 74 people in it, so it's a lot of folks. But it's not only that, it's also how we think about connecting with each other and how we plot with others for future projects.
And isn't that what family does?
Yeah.
Family's so loaded for me in a lot of ways. We've had this conversation a little bit within some of the members of SBAC, because family for me connotes a level of obligation that It's just problematic for me right now. Where I am in my point in my life, it's more problematic than collective to me.
I'm just
Collective
going to
is-
lean
is
into the
choice.
chosen family
Right,
piece.
right.
Yeah.
And that's
I
what I was
appreciate
thinking.
that.
Collective is choice.
I appreciate the chosen family. I would not be here without my own, and so
Yeah.
I think that yes, we choose each other, and I think the best thing about that is that you have the opportunity to continue to choose.
But I also think in language, I think of kin as different than family. And I'm having to sit with that a lot about what is the definition of kin and kinfolk. And they're not, we use them synonymously, but I don't think that they are synonyms.
Yeah, exactly. There are a lot of people that I call my brother or sister who are not. I think my own sister is here today, but there's a lot of people who I do consider family-like, and as a queer person, that's something that I've had to do at time to times. My own family relationships have been fraught, and we've had to find our way back to each other, but in the meantime, there were chosen people who I had to figure out how to be family with.
Right, and there are others who I feel a sense of kinship with because of certain way of being, certain ways of thinking, certain processes that are used as artists,
That was one of the things in one of the articles that's in your bibliography that I actually wrote down as I was reading through it, and
Which one?
It was about kinfolk, right? It was the response to the Solon. The kinfolk and the idea that kinfolk is parts of one another in that what happens to one is felt by the other, and that's, I think, what got me thinking about how empathy plays into all of this, right? We feel each other's experiences, right? And if we're not doing that, as we are not doing broadly, I think, like in society, and that's in many ways, but if we're not doing that, then we don't actually survive this, right? Like it's not sustainable. I think about sustainability in practice a lot, both from my own art practice, but also as someone who has been a mental health provider for a long time, right? If you can't do that work sustainably, that means taking care of yourself, taking care of your community, then you can't do it, period.
And I think, so kinship more than family connotes that sense of care. And you said mutuality earlier, that came up a couple times, and mutuality that I guess is implied by family, but I think so many of us have experiences of biological family that aren't necessarily that, and instead have the chosen family and the like, or chosen kin. That makes a lot of sense, that notion of care. And I do think for SBAC that is where we started and why we started. It's even if we didn't do any exhibition together, even though we ended up doing them and relatively early on decided that it's a network of care. It's a network of, I don't know, I don't want to do this anymore. And being able to lay that and just lay it out there, right? And have others hold the space for sitting through that or figuring through that, right? And holding the space for the care of that, and for changing our minds about it, 6 months later, year later, or minutely, as we were talking about earlier, so, yeah. I don't know where I was going with that. Caring, kin. Should I start riffing on a Fred Moten doing the care, or Sun Ra? Care, caring, kin, kinetic.
But I do think, go ahead, you have something else, Lauren? What were you about to say?
I was just thinking that, the artwork or the art, program or the panel, like that's where where those opportunities for those connections live, right? And like that's where we do feel each other's experiences, right? Like I might not know this artist personally, but I experience their work and something happens to me where I feel something, perhaps, gets stirred that is indescribable, but there's just there's a connection, there's a spark of connection. And that is a source of empathy, right? We need art to be able to provide that. It helps reframe blow the frame completely apart, right? Throw away the frame. It helps people reorient to each other, appreciate each other differently. You know, I think that in that way, creating art or creating art experiences or art relationships is where, you know, those connections that will keep us going and that sustain us exist. Doesn't mean I know the person personally or have to be related to them in any way, but I am related to them through a certain kind of knowing.
And I think that extends then, so I talk about this collective of 7. However, I also think that there's an intentionality of extending those connections to the people who view our work, to the people who come to a social practice night. So, for example, in Tucson, one of the other collective members has done a series of nights that we call Nourish, right? That, again, is not, so we've extended nourishing this 7 to nourishing others who come to be in this space, to have a meal, to do a salon-style conversation about, you know, it's a different way of art making that I think is extending then that network in a way, that connection, the kinship in a way, and sharing those different ways of being, empathy, care.
Yeah, and that's something that I know about their space in Tucson. It's called the Project/Space. There's, and I wouldn't call it necessarily at their store. How would you describe it specifically? Basically, it's kind of if you need something, you can come in.
But that was an iteration. That was a pop-up.
Pop-up, yeah.
So Liz did that as an artwork that she had things that Liz Deneau, who's another member artist, used to also be a fashion designer and had several things in her closet that she hadn't used for, so she put them out and people were asked to bring. She's also an art educator. She teaches at Tucson High and keeps a food and other kinds of things for her students. So you took a piece, you could take whatever that she had created. If you brought canned foods or hair care products or hygiene products for students, whatever, that she then keeps in her classroom for the round. So it was a thrift store, but no money was exchanged. Right. It was you bring something and take something in the space. Yeah.
And TAAC is offering these scholarships, right, that are a result of what happened at, yes, your Halloween party, but your network, right? And so to me, that shows that there's more than just a collective group of people that share a common practice. It extends into the broader community in a way that kinship models tend to produce.
Yes, the Halloween party is a separate affair, but you know it's all you know. Taos is a wonderful community. Everyone rallied behind that. The scholarship program, you know, that's sort of new for us. We have 2. We have the high school scholarship program with the New Mexico School for the Arts in Santa Fe. And then we also have the TAAC Scholars program. And, you know, it's our purpose to, again, create more accessibility in these very gate-kept domains in the art world. You know, and coming from living in New York for more than 20 years, you know, I'm very familiar with what that looks like, and you know that is not our purpose. And so creating opportunities to acknowledge a broader group of artists, including high school students, right? My goodness, if you haven't seen the works of the 3 high school students right across the way, I mean, wow, I'm really impressed with them. And this was the first time that they had the invitation to write an artist statement or a bio. That's something that we know as artists can be a lifelong work in progress, right? But that was an invitation for them, and we welcome them. And our TAAC Scholar program is an opportunity to similarly acknowledge an artist who's, you know, pushing the bounds of abstraction, and you know, and it is also a work in progress, and we're curious about what we'll develop with that, and as we're a new organization.
And we'll be stealing those ideas for SBAC.
They're yours.
I think that's a really good place to leave it, and we'll open up for questions. Yeah. But no,
thank you, Bradley.
Leaving
Thanks,
it
Liz.
with the youth, hopefully leaving a better place for them to exist in.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work to do to get there. I tend not to bite my tongue when talking about certain things, but I am today. So thank you, everybody, for being here. And I guess, will you moderate questions, or I can take them. I can field them. That's fine. So if anybody has one, I don't think this is portable, but just holler out. Yes.
Well, first, thank you so much. This has been incredible, and I feel so lucky to be here. And I was interested in hearing your point on the Southwest art. I just wanted to share with you that the Taos Society is backed by the government as well. So a lot of the art that we see from those early stages was the government's motivation to use it as a tool for settlement and for people to come out. So it was really shaped in an imagery way that I think you guys are representing exactly what contemporary Southwest art is now, that breaking those boundaries of what the government dictated, what this land looks like and what the culture looks like. And in relation to the container, it makes me think of the struggle being also the container itself, and geography falls into that. The Southwest has its own struggles that unite us as a community. And then into art, to be a Black artist in the Southwest, to be an abstract artist going against those government industries is really also a bonding point. And my question comes from a bit of a selfishness too, of managing a gallery, especially in the Southwest and in Taos. It's so hard to find diverse artists and more abstract artists. So we use TAAC as a reference or an archive of these undiscovered or emerging artists that need a bigger platform. And I'm wondering if there are any archival practices that SBAC is doing to help other galleries or museums see this collective of artists as a reference point as well.
We will be. Because I'm like a sponge stealing ideas every place I go. That's the privilege to me of being able to do things like this, is that, no, I'm not sure that we've thought about it intentionally, but I think we will. I mean, I do think the intent was to, one of our many intentions is to raise the visibility of Black artists in the Southwest. So, of course, we could, or I won't say I won't shoulda, woulda, coulda, but I think it's a great idea, and helping to make some more of those connections makes a lot of sense to me.
Oh, thanks, Montana, for your point. And I think that it's really well taken, this idea of the settler state, this idea of that driving, like the aesthetic, right? And that's something that I think we're rejecting that as a construct. And, and that also, that relies upon the displacement of people in order to create that narrative. And so when you disrupt that and you create more space, then I don't know, I feel very optimistic. In spite of what's happening in the world, I think I still find moments of optimism. So thank you for that.
We have a question right here in the front.
Well, not so much a question, but just an idea about how we choose family. I think many of us have chosen place the same way, and that brings an automatic connection. And if you want to go back to Taos Society of Artists, or even before the GI Bill, and because they were that, a lot of people left where they were from because they didn't want that family or strict bound of kinship, which came with a lot of cultural obligations, and this is how you're going to live your life, and you're going to do that. And they came and wanted to start over and self-describe. And I feel like probably most of the people in TAAC did not grow up here, and are maybe not even able to the Southwest, and yet we have chosen this place because it gave us the idea that we might find a community amongst other people who also chose this place. And so then what we form comes from the place, but it also moves the place in different directions because nothing is dead.
And I think that it's very salient. Thank you for sharing that for this whole conversation, because I part of the work that I'm doing in Nebraska has to do with homesteading, right? And that's how my family ended up there, and this notion of going from one place that you can't exist in anymore. In your soul you can't be there, and you're going to someplace else. And yet it also means displacement of other folks. And what does that mean? But what does it mean to have chosen a place? My great-grandfather ended up in that place intentionally. He had gone a couple of other places and not it. He knew he couldn't stay in the South. Emancipated and enslaved person, right? Couldn't stay in the South post-emancipation. Went to Wisconsin, not there, too cold probably. Northern Nebraska, that didn't work. Where he settled was intention. There was something else about that particular place that worked for him. And what I hear you saying is for all of the rest of us who are migrants in a different way, right, who have settled in the Southwest, it's the same thing. We chose this place for a particular reason, you know, conscious or not, and from that then are making our own networks, connections, kinships, communities, collectivities to make it work. And so then what is it, for me, you know, both of those sites, Nebraska and Arizona, is for the United States as a black woman a different way of being black than any place else in the country as well. And what does that mean? You know, Michelle Wright talks about the physical blackness and blackness not being a what, but a where and when, right? That there's this notion that it inflects differently because of geography, because of some of those choices, right? And all of that to then say, as we then think intentionally about expanding, right, the who based on the where and when we are, I think is the work of making collectives work in a way that honors geography, that honors people, that builds empathy rather than exclusion.
Yeah, I think, are we pretty close to time? We have one more. We have time for one more question. I'm just making sure.
I also say that, piggybacking off what Rhea had mentioned, is that in some way, in my mind, I see the collective, like, the kinship is like it within the geography, because somehow we've all ended up here. And then it's like collective is raising this consciousness around with the awareness of what you're doing and creating. And I'm not part of either one of these, but through these kind of the mechanics of the collective, I've been able to personally expand my whole like world that I would never have done in New York, right? And I think that that's so interesting. And my uncle, who's been out here for a really long time, the geography is like this source of that inspiration, because your mind is expanded to do things that you could never have done in a different environment, which is also a big part of that geography. And it takes a little more effort to get it done too, and I feel like that's a kinship, and we all kind of come together to keep it going. I don't know if that resonates at all.
It does.
Yeah, I really appreciate you mentioning the sort of, increased awareness or elevation of consciousness or shared consciousness. I think about consciousness a lot, like as a therapist, as an artist, as a person, and how, like, what is it? Like, who has it? Where does it come from? Which makes me think about the consciousness outside of just human consciousness, right? And there is something very, very compelling about, and again, I keep saying it's unnameable, but it's a feeling of being in community. And I've experienced this in New York also, but I think there's something very powerful here in Taos and in the Southwest. And I think it's that, it's that relational quality of making, right? Of the sort of generativity of spirit in creating artwork or creating, Jay, you create so much. You're not part of one of these groups. You create so much connection in the community in so many different ways and so many different platforms, and that is a practice, right? And so, anyway.
And Liz is right about the light.
Well, and
not denying the light.
Yeah, and I think there's more connections. Like, this conversation is going to make its way into the Nebraska exhibition. I can tell you all that already, for a couple of reasons. One, something you just said, and two, I had forgotten that Willa Cather, a Nebraska artist, wrote Death of a Bishop when she was out here. I was reminded of that in the last couple of weeks. And so I think there's long been a push and pull between these different geographies and how they inflect things in different ways. Yeah, I assume Hotel Willa is named after Willa Cather. That's probably not true, but it's like, maybe might not be. But anyway, yeah, it just, the conversations inform things in a different way. They spin things in a different way.
Yeah, we don't have this conversation about Southeastern art or these conversations about Midwestern art, right? There's not a conversation we have. There is something about this geography that does push and pull in a way. And I wonder, and I'm not asking questions again, but to come off of your question, I wonder what it is that draws this artists here in that way.
It's the light.
It's the light. It's the light. It is the light, yeah.
Just one quick comment. What drew me here was the people. Mm-hmm. And I'm a painter, and the light, I appreciate it, but that was almost 40 years ago. And I still say the same thing. It's the people in this community. There's an openness of spirit. And I always, in the beginning, and I'll still use it, is that I feel that people are very non-judgmental here. You can just really be yourself. And I feel that people are more interested in who that self is than really what you do and where you came from and all of those kind of things. So, anyway. So there's a soul there, and the light's got to carry that. Like it's located.
Any other comments or questions at all? Well, thank you everybody for coming out, and thank you Liz, and thank you Lauren so much.
Thanks, Liz.
Thanks, Bradley.